Yes, I would like to focus on wood pastures and parkland, which I think are the Cinderella habitat, very, very overlooked and misunderstood, but is very close to wilding. And of course, I've been involved in the wilding project at NEP, and I'm very, very excited about the results that it's showing us. So I want to talk about the ancient British forests and how far back our history we know. We can follow the history back. And really, the focus this evening is on what we call open grown trees, trees that can grow to full canopy. Anyway, let's see some pictures. And you people are extremely lucky because you live next to the New Forest, which is a top wood pasture and parkland ancient forest in Europe, a really, really important site. So you're extremely lucky to have that on your doorstep. So now, I did this just now and it worked, and now it's not wanting to, there we go. It might be a bit slow. So I probably have clicked twice and it'll jump in a second, but anyway. So as we've been saying, I'm a specialist in ancient trees. And so what can they tell us? Well, let's first of all think about the fact that some of our ancient trees can live a very, very long time. Though in the UK, yews are thought of as living the longest, and we think we have yews that date back to Roman times. But the next longest lived is really the oak tree. And this oak tree that we're looking at in front of us is about 700 years old. And it's the classic ancient tree. So the features of that are, it's obviously going to have a large girth because it's putting on a ring every year. So it's got to just get fatter and fatter and fatter. The next most important thing is that it's hollowing, and that process really kicks in maturity. And that's what makes these old trees so special, is because that decaying wood habitat isn't in younger trees. So that habitat is, if ancient trees are rare, then obviously the species that live on the decaying wood in these ancient trees is extremely rare as well. And they are under major threat across the world. The old tree habitats are absolutely not understood. And the other classic thing is that in old age, they start to, as we say, grow downwards. They start to shrink. Don't we all in old age start to shrink? We all lose our height a bit. And that's really interesting because you don't find ancient trees in what we call mainstream woodland. In fact, the government recently has done some research, and 99% of woodlands have no ancient trees within them. And only 1% has some younger trees. So that is immediately quite strange, because we've always thought of trees being, and we've always thought as woodland as being the richest habitat. You know, haven't we been told that? So I'm going to be a bit controversial, because no, it's not your mainstream woodland that is the richest habitat or one of the most important habitats. It's these wood pastures. So looking at this tree and this crown coming downwards, we can look back in time just through looking at this tree and understand the landscape around it for 700 years. And what do I mean by that? I mean, it can't have been enclosed by other trees at all. If it had been enclosed by younger trees growing up around it, then this would have happened. So here is an ancient tree that was growing happily in the open, and then they came along and planted lots of young trees around it. And what you can see here is that all the lower branches of this oak tree have been killed by lack of light. And that's why this talk is all about light and shade, because trees, we've only really started to think about the ecology of the biggest plants that we can see right in front of us. And they've been telling us this story for a long, long time, but we're only just starting to understand the language that they speak to us. And one of the things that they want us to know is that each species is adapted to light and shade in a different way to another species of tree. But in this particular case, we can see that this oak tree, if it had been continued to be kept in the dark, I mean, what they've done is they've haloed round it so that, you know, they've pushed back that young growth so that the tree can actually start to, well, it's not breathe again, but photosynthesize again. So it's all about the ecology of trees. Now here's another tree, and it happens to be our most light demanding tree species in the country. And that's in Britain, because it's a Scots pine. And again, this is one of the fattest Scots pines in Scotland. And again, you can see that it's absolutely open grown. And just where the chap, that's Ted Green standing there, just beside him is a massive, great horizontal limb that's just broken out of that trunk and fallen to the ground. And that trunk is bigger than, that branch is bigger than most Scots pines that you'll see generally around today. But again, it's classically hollowing. In this case, it's a pine, so it doesn't quite grow downwards in quite the same way, but it certainly has a flattening top. Now, one of the limbs that came off it had been cut, and one of the relatively small limbs, which had a diameter of about 50 centimeters, had 500 rings on it. So it probably, we can't really estimate how old that tree is, but it's definitely many, many centuries old. But take a look at this list then, because this is really, really important. You've got Scots pine, and this is the percentage of shade tolerance. So you can see it's very, very low shade tolerance. And then you've got junipers, and look at hawthorn. This is one of our classic so-called understory trees in woodland. I'm afraid it does not really like woodland. It can survive, but if you want it to flower and produce fruit, it won't do that in shade. And many of our so-called understory shrubs can survive in the dark or the deep shade, but they really won't propagate themselves in such conditions. They really should be called outstory tree layer. They really aren't part of the natural scenario of woodland. And this is what the whole debate about is now, is about the ecological natural processes that are happening in woodlands. But, you know, we'd all think, well, birch is quite light demanding, and then you can come down to oaks are pretty light demanding. But then after about 50%, you start to get into the ones that can tolerate the shade and do really well in quite increasing levels of shade. And you come through right to the very end. And surprisingly, yew is not considered the most shade tolerant of trees. It's actually beech, which is considered very, very shade tolerant. And beech really has an ecology where it can sit there in the understory and hunker there for years and years and years, waiting for a gap in the canopy, and then it might get away. But so that can survive in the shade. But also the other factor that we have to bear in mind is that whatever tolerates the shade also gives that amount of shade. So beech is very, very shade giving. And I don't really need to tell many people about walking into a beech woodland and what do you see on the ground? You virtually see nothing on the ground because it's so good at intercepting all the light and taking away all the light from getting down to the ground floor. And so what happens is that under Scots pine, you can get oak regenerating under Scots pine because oak can tolerate a little bit more shade than Scots pine, but you won't get Scots pine regenerating under any of these other species. Scots pine has to regenerate in the open, and that applies throughout. So you can get sycamore regenerating under ash, but you won't get ash regenerating under sycamore. So this is the critical thing. And it really is a serious issue that we've got to understand if we want to manage our landscape effectively. And the reason I say that is because we've been brought up with the Clements and Tansey theory of what we've called linear succession. And the whole idea is that we were taught that it was a closed canopy across the landscape, and if you had an opening, it got filled in and it gradually went to tall trees. What was forgotten about or not understood was that it will go to ever more shade-giving trees. Now we know enough from these minimum intervention or these abandoned sites in other parts of the world, where if that happens without the natural processes, and I'm going to come to that in a minute, if there's no natural processes happening, that will happen, and each generation of tree, the understory will be more shade tolerant and will overtake the upper story. So if you had oak there, over time, that's going to be displaced by beech. And this is what we can see very, very clearly in places like the Great Białowieża in eastern Poland, is that what was a wood pasture, open new forest type landscape has been completely taken over by very shade tolerant hornbeam, because beech isn't there in that part of the country, but it's been taken over by a very shade tolerant plant. And that, once that establishes, is going to be there for a very long time. So any light demanding tree is not going to get a look in for centuries, if not millennia. And of course, that has consequences for the biodiversity that's associated with those species that have come before. And that's really important to know, because if we manage in that way, we are going into what I would call a biodiversity extinction or a biodiversity dead end. What we have learnt in absolutely the most recent of times is about a different type of succession, which is called cyclical succession. And you can look at this in terms of economic markets, and they talk about cyclical marketing and other types of marketing. I can't remember what the title is, but this is really a dynamic mosaic where the habitat is moving across the landscape and changing as it moves across the landscape, and then creating, opening up again and allowing the whole thing to start again. And one of the key drivers, it's not the only driver, but one of the key drivers of this is the large herbivores. And of course, that's why I put the cattle in there, because as I said, with the ancient oak tree, the only way we can have ancient oak trees is if they can establish themselves in open landscapes and those landscapes are kept open by the big grazing animals. So this has to make us really, really rethink. And the UK has some of the most brilliant habitats of this kind that actually means that we can really demonstrate how important this is. So this idea of this cyclical succession came from this great guy, Franz Vera. And I was very, very lucky because I bumped into some Dutch boys in the late 90s or the mid 90s, and they knew of Franz Vera, and they knew he had published his thesis on this idea, his hypothesis, but it was in Dutch. And the only thing, they gave it to me, but the summary, there was an English summary, and there was a list of sites that Franz had been to across Europe that had helped him develop his thinking. And one of those was Białowieża. And the point that he made in Białowieża is that, yes, there are some big old oaks still there, but once they go, they are not being replaced. And if that happens, Białowieża is going to change into something very, very different to what it has been for thousands of years. And that's going to be a man-made decision. And the man-made decision is going to be what we would call minimum intervention. So it's completely counterintuitive. Minimum intervention means effectively stopping natural processes. And the natural processes are the large herbivores. And we can talk a bit more about Białowieża if you want to. But the key thing is that his view, his hypothesis is that the most natural landscapes are park-like. And they consist of all the habitats that we love in the UK and that has all the biodiversity. So that includes open grass or open herb-rich grassland and heathland, banks of scrub, the open-grown solitary trees, which are going to be ancients, and also patches of closed canopy. So it has everything in there. And the large herbivores are the absolute key to that particular process. So, you know, when we think about the Chatsworths, the Blenheims, the Windsor Great Parks, these are not cultural landscapes. They are the closest to the wildwoods of Europe. And getting that idea across to people is very, very hard, because we have had this idea that they are designed landscapes by Capability Brown, that he somehow managed to make these landscapes. Well, I'm afraid it isn't a recent phenomena. This is a very, very ancient situation. Anyway, he then published his theory in 2000 as Grazing Ecology and Forest History. And the picture on the front cover is, of course, the New Forest, which was an absolute beacon to Franz Vera in terms of helping him to formulate his theory. And there he is he was trained as a forester, but he puzzled over forestry because he understood the oak and he knew how light demanding the oak was, and he could not work out how oaks could work in the systems that he was being taught they should be working in. Anyway, carry on. So here's his theory. So you have a bit of open herb-rich grassland, and you have two types of scrub which start to come into that grassland. Now, we don't know very much about how scrub establishes in these open landscapes, and it's very, very fascinating. I think you have to have ancient forbs, you know, ancient perennial plants, you know, flowers, and then the scrub gets established in that. Anyway, we don't know a huge amount about it, but compare and contrast. Here in the picture, we've got hawthorn and we've got blackthorn, and you can see the blackthorn because of the white flowers in the spring. But let's start with hawthorn. And this hawthorn is quite clearly supporting an open solitary tree. And that tree then grows on to be a full canopy, open grown tree. And that's because hawthorn doesn't sucker. So the grazing pressure keeps the hawthorn tight, and the tree grows up as a solitary tree. On the other side, you have the blackthorn, and as you can see, it's pushing out into this landscape, and the seedlings get established in the edge of the sloe, in the edge of the blackthorn. They grow up, and then they drop acorns into the edge again, and then into the edge again, and then into the edge again. So this is how we get a grove of trees, but it's a circle encircled by this scrub that is expanding out all the time. Now you'll say, well, why doesn't that just expand and expand and expand and take over everything? Well, I'm going to come to that. But this is all backed up by the fact that oaks have developed an ecological relationship. Now, you don't get this sort of ecological relationship building up very easily. This is a deep, deep historical ecological process with the jay. And the jay plants the acorn just where the acorn really has enough light to respond to the light, but it has enough protection from the thorny bushes for it to not be grazed out. And this is what we can see so clearly on the Knepp estate, this process. And we can see it in some of the best landscapes that remain in Europe. And here you can see it actually happening. And this is the New Forest. So you've got your thorny scrub or your bramble contained, and you get your oak establishing as a single tree within that thorny scrub. And we have two very old sayings which were old in the mid 1500s. One is British, and it says, or English, and it says the thorn is the mother of the oak, and the French version is the bramble is the cradle of the oak. And so it could be any thorny material, and in the background you've got gorse, and you've got another tree coming up in the gorse at the background there. So this is the process, and it's the grazing that then keeps these open. So this oak is destined to be a very, very ancient oak tree. And ideally, it's going to grow up to a huge mature tree. And the dear old Germans have done the study. They've thrown a net over a tree like this, and they've counted every single leaf. And they've thrown a net over a plantation oak and counted the leaves on that. And the open grown tree has 20 times the leaves of the plantation tree. Now, that means to me that it's got 20 times as many flowers, 20 times as much pollen, 20 times as much nectar. So for me, these hemispheres of leaves are incredibly important. But not only that, the plantation tree has no branches because it's designed not to have any side branches, whereas the open grown tree has these big horizontal or pushing out horizontal branches, so sought after by the builders of the past because it has built-in strength for acting as a beam across the ceiling, but also that's a unique habitat for many, many species. So if you just have plantation trees, you will never get the full range of biodiversity that we get through having open grown trees. And it's generating open grown trees in the most natural wild way, which is so, so important and so overlooked in modern day. But let's just recap on this grove, because this is the New Forest again. What happens in the grove? And this is the big misunderstanding, is that within the grove, you get the trees in the middle are starting to age. They can't grow downwards because they're surrounded by younger trees, but they gradually collapse and start opening up the crown, opening up the canopy. Now, grazing animals come in and prevent regeneration. Now, this is the contrary to what we've been told. We've always been told, oh, those pesky deer, those pesky animals getting in and eating off all the regeneration. No, no, no. This is what it was designed to do, because this open landscape is kept open by the grazing animals. It increases in size. It increases in size. It then becomes your open habitat, your open herb-rich grassland or your heathland. And then the whole process starts again. You get the regeneration of the scrub into the open landscape where there's plenty of light, and then you can start regenerating your open grown trees again. So that is the system. That is the wild system that predates, well, it predates really the change in product that we wanted from our woods And our product changed about the 1600s. From Coppice standards, we wanted bigger diameter materials, so we started producing plantations. But it's a forestry system designed for production of material. It is not a natural system. It is purely designed for our productivity. Any biodiversity comes is a byproduct of that, and actually in terms of a plantation is very low. So here are we've got to rethink our large herbivores, and we've got to rethink about the fact that in the wildwood we had the roe deer, and we had elk, but we've gone, we had the bison, we had the aurochs, or the equivalent of the domestic. Now we've got these analogues, which are cows and horses to replace the and the pigs to replace the wild versions. The only ones that are across are sheep and goats, and I'm afraid sheep and goats are an absolute nightmare. And why any ecologist thought sheep were good for biodiversity, I don't know. They are a tool for damaging the regrowth of scrub. Now, yes, okay, if you want your grasslands kept open and you haven't got your cattle or your aurochs or your bison or whatever, then that is a different mechanism to do it. But I'm afraid sheep are really seriously bad news. So in this wild landscape and in the new forests, you've got your cattle, you've got your horses, you've got your pigs, you've got your deer. Now we have got fallow deer as well, and they're supposedly really native to Southeast Europe, and therefore there's a battle going on between grazing animals and the strategies that plants have to resist grazing. So most of our native British plants have got good strategies to resist being browsed completely out. But two things. First of all, if you import animals from abroad, like muntjac or other species of deer, they usually have mechanisms to break through our native plant strategies. So that's one thing. But also, you know, we haven't got a proper natural landscape. I mean, most people say, well, we haven't got wolves. It's not really a question of wolves. They don't really control populations in a direct sense in terms of taking such numbers of animals, but they do change behavior, and behavior leads to starvation, and starvation, lack of food, is what controls grazing animal populations. Anyway, that's a long story. But let's just think about this, because not only do we have the theories of how this works, and we can see how this works and the ecology of it, we also have other sources of evidence that show us that this was happening pre-man having a big impact on the landscape. And particularly, I mean, this is a picture from Windsor, the ancient beech trees there. And of course, we have had, and the kings of England have had, a very long love affair with deer. And really, it's the deer that have influenced much of our landscapes. Unfortunately, aurochs have disappeared quite early on, but deer, of the ones that have been painted, the wild herbivores that were painted in the caves of Lascaux and Altamira, deer is the only one that survived, and survived in the wild. And for me, that's an incredible statement. And it really rankles with me when people start attacking native deer, and by that I mean red deer and roe deer, because basically we people have made the conditions such that if they are having a big impact on the landscape, it's because of what we're doing, rather than they are native animals and they have an absolute right to be here and to manage and to be helping us to create the most rich biodiverse landscapes. So, you know, we've got the deer there and we've got these ancient forests. Well, you know, as I say, we've got this map here, which is very early medieval. This is Anglo-Saxon map by the Anglo-Saxon specialists, people like Delahooke, who studied trees and Anglo-Saxon landscapes in the chronicles. And already they can pick out the great forests of Britain. So here you've got the forest, the New Forest and the Forest of Beer. This is Windsor Great Park and Windsor Forest here, Selwood Forest. This is Wychwood, and in Wychwood you've got Blenheim Palace and you've got Charlbury. They are the remnants of this. They're with the fantastic ancient trees, they're remnants. Fortunately, the Dean has been very influenced by forestry, but as you go up, you've got, and here is Sherwood up here, and Sherwood's got an amazing collection of ancient oaks. Wychwood's got an amazing collection of ancient oaks, the New Forest, Windsor Great Park, etc. So we know that our oaks and our heritage of oaks really goes back to these really ancient landscapes. And if we look at a definition of forestry or forest, which was in the 1755, it was a wild woody ground, but with pastures, open space, where the wild beasts and the wild birds of the forest were, and that was in the safe protection of the king for his pleasure. These forests under Norman kings were the most protected landscapes. They were of, William introduced from Europe incredible nature conservation legislation, which was forest law. And that has given us this legacy of these fantastic locations and the biodiversity that's associated with them for over a millennium. And that is just incredible. And then if we look at Saxton's map of 1587, look at the iconography of this map. This is not dense planting. This is open grown trees. And if you look at all the other forests where I've just shown you of the Anglo-Saxon maps where they still existed by this time, this is the landscape that he depicts, these open grown trees. Plantation forestry did not exist in Elizabethan times. It was yet to come. They wanted the open grown trees for their great fleets of ships. They did not want plantation trees. They wanted the knees and the elbows and the shapes for their buildings and for their transport. So the change came later than this. And of course, this is one of the most famous of these great Norman forests. This is Windsor, of course, which still has red deer and these fantastic collection of ancient trees. And this has one of the top collections of ancient associated biodiversity with these old trees. It is the top site in England that we know, and that's probably because they threw the common. It was such an important place for the king that they threw the commoners off, whereas in the New Forest, the commoners have had a continuing role, and the commoners, by hook or by crook, took a lot of decaying wood away. So it's not had quite the same history as somewhere like Windsor Great Park. But as these great forests shrank, so the areas which were the deer lawns, L-A-U-N-D-S, which became lawns, and we have lawns in front of our houses because of deer lawns, because they were close cropped grass. These areas that were left as the forest shrank, which were rich in these old trees, were protected as medieval deer parks. And the main reason for these ancient oaks to be retained is for the acorns, which were so important for the deer to carry them, the protein in the autumn, to carry them through to spring. So the big oak, the big seed producing trees were hugely protected, along with holly and ivy. And holly and ivy were the fodder for the deer during the winter as well. And they were strongly protected as well. They were the species that were protected in the Norman times. And obviously the New Forest has those in abundance. So, and you also in Southampton have a fantastic common, although I haven't ever visited it, but also from the, so we've been talking about the rich and the powerful having these very important landscapes, these parks and these forests for them, for their leisure and for their enjoyment. But obviously the working landscapes of the commons, particularly with their pollards, were also very, very important. And this is a view from Epping Forest, where Epping has had a long history again of commoners. And so there's a lot of pollarding that happened as well as grazing as well. And it allowed for the wood production to happen, but also the meat production. And when we talk about silvopastoralism or agroforestry, what we're talking about is similar to these past ancient landscapes where you had trees and grazing operating together, sort of two-tier agriculture. And these are much richer for productivity than pasture or woodland alone. And these landscapes, there's not a lot of research, but these landscapes are supposed to be better for carbon sequestration and also for carbon storage. So wood pastures should be what we should be promoting for the climate crisis as well. And it would benefit us from biodiversity. It would be a double win if we could promote these. But don't just trust me. Many of you will have heard of Francis Rose. Sadly, he died, I think, just back at the turn of the century. I mean, he was a fantastic botanist. He was an absolute giant of botany. And Paul Harding was a top, or it was, I mean, he's retired. Don't think he's died yet, but Paul Harding, a top invertebrate specialist. And they came together to write this book, Pasture Woodlands in Lowland Britain, which was published in '86, all that time ago. And in it, they said that pasture woodland was closer to wildwood than standard, than high forest or plantation. It's the only structure where the primeval forest, the old growth, these old trees, still exists as an ecosystem brought on since the last ice age. The species that are associated with these important landscapes are species associated with the richness of the old trees. And in the UK, we have something which is truly, truly exceptional because of the history of the landscape. If you go to Spain, you'll see fantastic common lands. And if you go to Transylvania, you'll see fantastic common lands. But in the UK, we still retain this aristocratic landscape, which has got the maidens in it, the uncut trees, and they tell an incredible story, an incredible historic story, which is different to what we can see in Spain and in Transylvania. And in between those countries, there's virtually nothing. So it just shows you how special we are. And as I say, it's all about the mature and aging trees, because these have the best decaying wood habitats of all, and it's standing and it's live as with the tree. As the tree fattens, so the decaying wood gets better and better for the invertebrates inside. The outside of the tree for Francis Rose's fantastic lichens. And you've got the fungi, the decay fungi, the specialist decay fungi, hollowing, but you've also got fantastic mycorrhizal fungi with these trees as well. So those are the key species that we're talking about. And it was Oliver Rackham that has said 10,000 plantation oaks of 200 years old will not be a substitute for one 500-year-old open grown oak, because they just do not have the habitat that the 100-year-old open grown oak will have. And if you release those 200-year-old oaks and you halo drown them, they would not suddenly develop open crowns. They have to have open crowns right from the word go. So a piece of work that Natural England did back in 2010, they looked at do you remember the Biodiversity Action Plan species? I mean, since Brexit, I'm afraid these have gone into sort of the dim and distant past. But the guys at Natural England took the Biodiversity Action Plan species associated with, so-called associated with woodlands, and I say so-called, and then they looked at the niches for these. And look at this, open grown veteran trees, 41%, more than 40% of the species on the Biodiversity Action Plan are associated with veteran trees. Another 40% are associated with glades, rides and edges. And another 28% is associated with scrub mosaic. This is the wood pasture landscape. This is where our biodiversity species are. Now, either all those experts are wrong, or we're getting it mightily wrong, because actually closed canopy has quite a modest amount of associated biodiversity species. And if you drill into that, it's really specialist habitat. We're talking about extreme specialist habitat like wet woodland or beech yew woodland, where these are Biodiversity Action Plan species are associated with them. So again, another piece of evidence that's telling us what we should be focusing on in terms of the future. So just to reiterate, these fantastic old trees are the keystone. They are, and the beach boys in Europe, they went to the remotest beach landscapes that they thought they could find in Europe, up on the Carpathians, way, way, way away from people. And they came up with a suite of species that they said were indicators of old growth beech forest. And then we start looking at that list and we think, well, they're in the New Forest. They're in Burnham Beeches. This is beech associated species. They're in Windsor Great Park. You know, they're right within our urban landscapes. They're not associated with the remote. They're associated with the habitat, and the habitat is in these wonderful wood pastures, these ancient forests with the continuity back to the Ice Age. Just as another aside, Alios Farjon did this lovely study on ancient oaks in England, and he looked at ones which were 6 to 6.6 meters and above, and he used the ancient tree inventory as the basis of his study. Now, the ancient tree inventory is not complete, so it's not fully there. But he also had a cutoff point of 9 meters for the medieval oaks or the Norman oaks, because he felt that anything that was of this was definitely back into that Norman time frame. And when he counted up, we had 126 in England alone, which were 9 meters or more, whereas in the whole of the rest of Europe, including Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, and I mean from Portugal to Poland and from Scandinavia down to the Mediterranean, there are 97. So that gives you an indication of the continuity of these old trees in the UK and why we have such important biodiversity associated with them. These landscapes have been managed in a the closest we can get to the natural since the last Ice Age. So just to say, we have something really stunning in the New Forest, which is only second to Windsor in terms of its biodiversity associated with the deadwood habitat. And it's just such an enormously important landscape. And yet most ecologists in Britain really, you hardly hear them talk about how important the New Forest is. It should be it is, we know it's important biodiversity wise, but I mean, it's right up there. It's really right up there in European terms, not just UK terms. And of course, we need to the Lawton principles, you know, the whole point is these old growth habitats, these old tree habitats, the priority is to protect them, if necessary, where they're degraded, restore them, and then buffer and recreate for sustainability. So, you know, if I walk into the New Forest, I can see the impact of the Forestry Commission in the New Forest. And I think that we should be restoring the forest and taking away the forestry that has been imposed in the last 100 years on the New Forest, because I think it is not the right thing to be doing in what is one of the most important habitats in the whole world to me. We can debate that. So, as I say, the old saying is, this is wild tree establishment. This, to me, is one of the rarest things that is going on in Europe today, is wild establishment of trees. We like to plant, don't we? And we like to plant trees just where we want them. And I'm afraid that is not what biodiversity wants. So where is this wild, where are these wild landscapes? Well, we've got good ones in the UK, but I've circled it in red because we're not looking after them in the way that we need to. So it's really sad what's going on in the UK, because we just can't seem to get any traction. From 1986, when the great ecologists were telling us this was internationally important, we're getting virtually no traction whatsoever. And in fact, there's huge threats on the horizon from all this number planting that's going on. Spain is absolutely astonishing for its common land tree landscapes, unbelievably wonderful. Romania is wonderful in terms of the landscapes, but it's disappearing like crazy, as it is in Turkey. I'm afraid we are absolutely doing the wrong things in these places as well. And the only other beacon on the horizon is Scandinavia, where they've passed laws since the last century to say all hollow oak trees are protected. They've got European legislation to protect some of the best habitats. You know, they are doing the right thing there, but Sweden hasn't got very much, because, as a Swedish ecologist was telling me just the other night, because they did massive tree planting in the 1930s, and it absolutely took away so much of their important biodiversity landscapes. So he tells me, not me, he tells me that Sweden's lost vast amounts through ridiculous tree planting schemes. So this is what's really worrying us in the tree world. And I'm afraid I have to say, I do not like this one bit, and I do not think this is good for biodiversity. This is a recipe for timber production, and we need timber. And I'm not arguing for against timber production. In the same way, you know, we need to eat, we need wood. I'm all for it, but in the right place. And don't kid ourselves that by doing this sort of planting, we are helping biodiversity, because we definitely are not doing so. They might be interesting for the first 10 years of these landscapes, not because of the trees, but because the grass has grown long. And that takes us back to the natural England thing, which says long grass and edges are good for biodiversity. But the moment these canopies close, the biodiversity interest plummets. And so I'm afraid I am absolutely against this numbers race. And it's just a race for somebody to pick a big figure and then try and say, we're going to do bigger figures and we're going to do bigger figures. And everywhere we go, people are saying, oh, we've got to plant up parklands in towns. No, 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 no. Let's have the open grown trees and let's have the proper parks in towns, because they are so important for recreation and the open grown tree. And this example here, you can see that the planting goes right up against the edge trees, which are open grown, and they will kill that side of the tree as they grow up. And it's just not correct to be doing this. So in conclusion, and I've gone on quite a long time, these park-like treescapes are the Cinderella habitat, but they're of international value. They are the closest we can get to the wildwood. Forget your closed canopy stuff and your plantation. That isn't what we're doing right. We're just producing timber from those. And they are grazed landscapes. And at the moment in the UK, they are extremely vulnerable because the trees aren't protected. We can't seem to get the right incentives in place to encourage people to do the right thing. And we have these armies of people going out advising landowners, and I'm afraid they are not briefed properly to give the right advice. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. And